Because when you think of it, there's nothing more important than health. Doesn't matter how much money you've got, doesn't matter how many possessions you've got, it means nothing if you don't have health. So let's talk about health. And what I want to talk about is the global epidemic of non-communicatable chronic diseases. The World Health Organization recognizes this as the leading cause of death around the world. The thing is about these diseases, and these are diseases such as heart disease, stroke, cancer, we can't get them because we're sitting next to a person with them. You're not going to get cancer because you're sitting next to a person with cancer. These are diseases that we know come from lifestyle and environment. That's actually good news because that means we can prevent them by changing our lifestyle. That's one of the things that's very important about this conference. We know that food is a very important part of this epidemic. But we also know environmental exposures are. And the ones which are most underreported but have a big role in this epidemic, radiation, which we've heard about from speakers, but also chemicals and pesticides. The issue of chemicals and pesticides is largely ignored when we look at this epidemic, even though we have a lot of science to show their role. The reason why it's largely ignored is because our authorities will say all the pesticides, all the chemicals have been analysed by good science and they are safe. Trust us, they are safe. Well, let's look at this science. Well, the truth is, now there's actually more than 100,000 chemicals since I wrote my book. Get more and more all the time, and less than 1% are actually scientifically tested. The vast majority of chemicals we are exposed to have zero scientific testing. New chemicals are made every day and put out there in the environment. They turn out also in our bodies with zero scientific information. Pesticides are one of the few groups of chemicals where there is some testing. So let's look at it. When a farmer uses a pesticide, it is a formulation. It is a cocktail of different ingredients. One they call the active ingredient, the others they call inerts. These inerts aren't inert, they're added because they make the active ingredient work more effectively. Some of them are solvents, others are adjuvants. They have a range of roles, but when the company, the pesticide company, submits the pesticide for testing, they only have to nominate one of these ingredients. And usually, that one ingredient is less than 5% of the mixture. A lot of times it's less than 1% of the mixture. And yet there is an assumption that just by testing this one ingredient, that the toxicity of this one ingredient is the same as the toxicity of the cocktail of ingredients. In the scientific literature, in the independent scientific literature, there is only one study that looks at a lifetime exposure to a formulated pesticide at the actual levels we are exposed to. In this case, it's parts per billion. It's about 1,000 times less than is permitted as safe by our regulatory authorities. And what it showed is that the exposed animals, all of them, all the female animals developed mammary tumours, except for one that had an ovarian tumour. They all had various degrees of kidney damage and liver damage. And I think what's really important about this study is that the particular rat they used is used by toxicologists because it's a very good model for human exposure. That's why it's used. This actual study was actually based on an earlier study by Monsanto, the maker of Roundup. And in this case, they did a 90-day study, but Professor Seralini looked at the 90-day study, and while Monsanto said there was no problems with it, he could see major problems and wrote up a paper showing that Monsanto had not analysed the data, and in 90 days could see problems. But he went and replicated the study, but instead of doing it for 90 days, decided to do it for 2 years, which is the lifetime of a rat. And after the 90-day period, that's when they started to see all the problems. The difference between the controls, and the controls are the ones who did not get the glyphosate, and the animals that did get the glyphosate. In this study also, they looked at the GMO and the combination of the GMO and Roundup. All three caused mammary tumours and other tumours in the animals and substantial damage to various tissues of the body compared to the animals that were not controlled. And this is a really important issue here. So here we can look at the slides and see, and there they show the areas of damage to different tissues. And I think what's really important about this is, I'll say again, this is the levels that most of us here will have in our blood and urine systems, because Roundup is like the new DDT. It's everywhere. It's in water, it's in food. Nearly everybody who's tested has Roundup. And of great concern is it's in breast milk, and we know it crosses the placenta. It's affecting our babies before they're born and after they're born. The other one we hear, oh yes, there's lots of chemicals. Yes, there are residues, but the amounts are too small to cause any problems. So let's look at this science and deconstruct it. Many chemicals that they will say are safe in parts per million, when they start going down to smaller levels, parts per billion and parts per trillion, start acting like hormones. And they can disrupt our hormone system, our endocrine system. They're called endocrine disruptors. And the science shows that, parts per billion and parts per trillion can cause great damage, particularly to the developing fetus. What is a part per trillion? That is one drop of water in 3 Olympic-sized swimming pools of water. I want you to imagine how small that is. But we know, with research looking at how the fetus develops, is that chemicals in parts per trillion act like hormones. And what these small amounts of hormones do is activate the genes at particular times to start developing the fetus. So the signal to say, now is the time to make eyes or fingers or the brain or our reproductive system or our metabolic system. And if those signals are interfered with, it affects the development of the child. These are known as programming events. And in many cases, they can't be unprogrammed. The child will develop with these problems for the rest of their life. The issue here is that many of these chemicals are approved based on work at parts per million with zero science looking at what actually happens at parts per billion and parts per trillion when they can act as hormones. The fact is, according to the World Health Organization, we have over 800 chemicals that act in this way. And just to explain, the graph up there is the standard model used by our regulatory authorities. It's based on a scientific concept that's more than 400 years old. The dose makes the poison. In other words, what they're trying to say, as you go lower in dose, the toxicity goes lower, and if you get down low enough, it's no longer toxic. It no longer causes any problems. And that's what they work on. However, the new science shows that there are many chemicals. The World Health Organization recognizes over 800 of them, that you get down to a certain low level, and as you get lower, the toxic effect, the damage effect increases. It's called a non-monotonic dose. And this is recognized in the 1990s, and for instance here the US EPA in the 1990s was supposed to act on this, and other regulatory agencies, and as yet not one of the 800 known chemicals has been banned based on this. It's been neglected. But we know these chemicals are causing massive problems. For instance, a lot of them will act like artificial estrogens, and they're strongly implicated in the epidemic of cancers of sexual tissues. And this is breast, ovarian, cervical, endometrial, prostate, and testicular cancers, but also in the reproductive problems. Things like endometriosis now, which is a major silent epidemic that's just starting to get the attention it deserves. All of us probably have friends who suffer from endometriosis. Ovarian insufficiency, falling sperm counts, normal sperm, and then urinary genital defects in young children, particularly young boys. And we know in some cases this is due to grandparents' exposure. So the other myth we hear is that the modern chemicals aren't like the bad ones. You know, when Rachel Carson wrote Silent Spring, they said, you know, and they banned DDT. They said the problem with DDT was that it's very residual, long-lasting. The new chemicals aren't residual, they aren't long-lasting, they don't leave residues. Well, if that was the case, if they didn't leave residues, why do we need maximum residue levels for them? Because they leave residues. Yeah. But, you know, and we have to have acceptable daily intakes for them because they're all through our food. And the testing shows most foods and most people have multiple residues. The other thing they say, oh, look, these chemicals, they break down very quickly. And so the assumption is once they break down, they go away, they disappear into nothing. And we can all live happily ever after. They sort of neglect to mention that most of them, when they break down, they actually become more dangerous. So the organophosphates, for instance, and the neonicotinoids, which are the two most common groups of pesticides that are used, when they break down, they are usually 100% to 300% more toxic. In other words, yes, they break down. Now, they are even worse. And, the most common group now, the neonicotinoids, the ones that are implicated in killing bees, in Europe they're banning them for bees, or each time they ban one, it's a bit like whack-a-mole. The pesticide companies changed the chemistry a bit, slightly, put a new name on it and put out two new ones, but they're essentially the same chemistry. But when they break down these neonicotinoids, we know now they're particularly dangerous, particularly for children, and they can cross the blood-brain barrier and cause major damage to the developing brain. And I'll talk more about that because I think this is a huge issue amongst all the different issues. But what is very important is that we know that most of these chemicals form these metabolites. We know actually they're more residual than the actual chemical, and yet there's very little testing for it. And yet where independent testing is done, we can find these residues in our food, in our bodies, and in our urine. So let's talk about the people who assure us it's safe. They're doing a wonderful job looking after us. They're using great science. Our pesticide regulatory bodies, such as the EPA here in the States. We'll talk about the actual process. I talked about the gold standard in science, which is peer-reviewed science. Peer-reviewed science is where a researcher without conflicts of interest, or they openly declare their conflicts of interest, publish a paper, and other scientists independently, and this is a blind process, the researchers don't know these other experts, they look at the paper and check it for accuracy. Once it's all revised, it's published in a reputable scientific journal, so all of us can look at it, read it, understand it, and decide whether, we agree with it. But this is an open and transparent process based on good science, the gold standard. This gold standard is largely ignored by the regulatory authorities because they instead get their studies from the pesticide industry, not from independent scientists. So the pesticide industry does the studies and decides which ones it will submit. Are they going to submit the ones that will damage their case? No. They will submit the ones that make their products look good. But if we want to look at these studies and actually have a look at the science, we can't, because they are commercial in confidence. We, the people who have to eat these pesticides and feed them to our children, should have the right to look at the studies our authorities are using, and we should have the right to have other experts look at it, but we can't. This process is totally hidden. We also know there's a revolving door. I don't know how many people listened to Jeffrey Smith yesterday talking about GMOs, but it's the same with pesticides. The people from the pesticide industry end up getting jobs as managers in the regulatory bodies, and they're the ones who make the decisions. And on top of that, the actual committees that sit down and review these studies submitted by the pesticide industry have people who receive money from these same pesticide industries. This is a conflict of interest, or what many of us would call a totally corrupt process. It is the equivalent of the foxes running the hen house. And what I want to say here is that where we get these studies, they're either not good enough to be peer-reviewed, or when we look at them and have independent toxicologists look at them, we usually find more evidence of harm, not less. We need to change this so that it is an open and transparent process based on good science. But at this stage, I will say clearly that there is not one decision by one regulatory agency, government regulatory agency on this planet, that we can trust. The only one that I'm prepared to trust, because it is open, is the World Health Organization, and I'll talk more about that. So let's talk about what I regard as probably one of the biggest crimes, is the fact that our children are being poisoned by pesticides, and this is being ignored. The fetus, the newborn and growing children, do not have the same protective liver enzymes that adults have. As adults, we have enzymes that can break down poisons. In other words, if we have a few drinks of alcohol, most of us have the enzymes that can break it down. There's some people who can't, and they can die very quickly from alcohol. But most toxins, we can break them down because our liver has the ability to put out enzymes. But the developing fetus and the newborn do not have these enzymes. And that means they have no ability to break down any toxic pesticides. The peer-reviewed science shows that the smallest amounts of pesticides do serious damage to children. And in the literature, what we'll see that pesticides cause in children: lower IQs, attention deficit hyperactive disorder, the autism spectrum, cancers, organ damage, autoimmune diseases, lack of physical coordination, loss of temper, anger management, the whole bipolar schizophrenia spectrum, depression and youth suicide, and also childhood obesity, because we know it's not just junk food, it's actually the way the metabolic systems are being changed, and they don't have the ability to burn the sugars. Their bodies convert them into fat straight away and start to store it rather than actually burning them. It's a major issue that we are understanding is caused by the endocrine disruption effect of these chemicals. Another issue, another epidemic, cancer, touches all of us. And one of my favorite studies, one that's been totally ignored, came out in 2010. Under President Obama, is the US President's Cancer Panel study. And this study is done by more than 30 of the world's best cancer specialists. And they looked at hundreds of peer-reviewed scientific papers. And what's really important here is that this idea that, cancers are bad, like it's in your genes, that's not true. 80% of cancers are due to environmental toxins, especially chemicals and pesticides. The other environmental toxin, which they acknowledged, is radiation. And I think it's good that we've got speakers here today talking about the issue of cell phone radiation. It's something that we really need to deal with. But still, they say that chemicals and especially pesticides are the main causes. They give really good evidence how this epidemic in childhood cancers are caused by pesticides. And what I want to show here is, that was 2010, nothing's done about it. You get the World Health Organization's International Agency for Research into Cancer, and they find that we still have a growing epidemic in childhood cancers. It's not going backwards, it's going up and not being recognised or acted upon. But all cancers are going up, or most of them. And particularly, we know that with this increase in cancers, that for most of the world, the mortality, the death rate is going up. Now, some cancers, such as breast cancer, the rates of breast cancer are still going up, but if you're lucky enough to live here in the US or in Europe, the rates of mortality are going down because of treatment. But if you live in the rest of the world, the number of women dying of these cancers is still going up because they don't have the medical facilities that those of us that live in advanced developed countries have. So this is a cruel epidemic that is still on the rise. I just want to show you this. This is here in the United States, part of the same study, and this is looking at thyroid cancer. And I chose this because thyroid cancer is one of the cancers that the World Health Organization looked at when they did their report on glyphosate, and we'll talk more about it. But once again, the yellow bars are the number of people who are being diagnosed with thyroid cancer. I want you to look at the green line. We'll go back to the 1970s here. And the green line is the trend rate, pre-1990s. And what you could see was thyroid cancer, the levels of diagnosis were fairly steady, just going up and down a little bit, but they were level. And then in the mid-1990s, it skyrockets. And the red line is the increase in Roundup and glyphosate. And the blue one is the increase in the growth of GMOs, Roundup-ready GMOs, because they're related. The increase in glyphosate is due to the increase in Roundup-ready GMOs. And once again, when we did our probability analysis, it's a 1 in 10,000 chance that they are not linked, that it is an accident. A year after we published that, the World Health Organization published its study showing or classifying Roundup or glyphosate, the active ingredient in Roundup, as the second highest level of being carcinogenic. And I need to explain that because what people hear, it's probably carcinogenic. They said it's probably carcinogenic to humans. What this level 2A means, it is definitely carcinogenic in animal studies. In this case, they found that it causes cancer in rats, mice, and dogs. And there's a range of cancers, including what I wanted to show you was thyroid cancer. There is limited evidence of it causing cancer in humans, and this is non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, which is where at the moment, according to Jeffrey Smith yesterday, the amount of people suing Monsanto Bayer is up to 45,000 now for getting it. Yeah, and let's... Thank you. And I'd like to also say I hope this is the start of more court cases for more pesticides too, that hurt them where it really hit them where it really hurts. So, look, I just explained again that the highest level for a carcinogen is type 1, and that's where we have lots of evidence in humans. So, for instance, asbestos. Of course, it's still not banned here in the US, but it's banned in most other countries in the world. Smoking, drinking alcohol, benzene. There's a whole range of these compounds that we know definitely cause cancers in humans. When they did this review, a lot of the toxicologists wanted to give Roundup the highest level of causing cancer, but there's this sort of argument, so they knocked it down a notch. But what I'd like to say is when you see studies that something causes multiple cancers in multiple animals, you can bet your bottom dollar that it causes cancer in humans, because believe it or not, we are animals as well. So somehow something's going to cause cancer in animals but not in us is an absolutely ridiculous idea. Yes, this thing causes cancer. It's clear. We can't wait for governments. We can empower ourselves and make this change and make the difference. We have lots of scientific studies, good studies, showing that when we put children and ourselves on organic diets, that we can get these pesticides out of our bodies within days. That is incredible news. And that means we can make a difference. And really importantly, and the reason I wrote my book, Poisoning Our Children, I wrote it particularly for moms and dads, that if you're going to have children, start eating organic now. Get this out of your body. As parents, I always, and personally I believe out of all the things I've done in life, the most important thing, the thing I've gotten the most joy out of, is being a parent. And, we, as parents, it's our responsibility to do the best we can for our children. And giving them organic is the best way we can assure that they can have a healthy life. And not just pesticides. I can show you the studies if we start talking about antioxidants, flavonoids, particularly, when we're talking about the plant-based phenols, phenolic compounds. The research shows, on average, organic food has around 30% more than industrial food. And we know that these compounds are very good at preventing all these chronic diseases we're talking about, and very important in us curing them. So it's not just avoiding the pesticides, it's also giving them the best quality food. What we want to do, instead of giving them a lifetime of ill health, give them a lifetime of the best health. And so I would argue that organic food is the best value food you can get, because you're going to save, thousands and thousands of dollars in doctor's fees alone. But more importantly, for me, I suppose what I want to ask is, what type of civilization poisons its children? I just think that, future historians are going to look back at us and go, this must be the dumbest civilization on the planet. They've had thousands of scientific papers showing them how dangerous these things are, and yet they've ignored it and poisoned their future. That's idiocy. And what I would like to say is we can empower ourselves and turn it around and make a difference and buy organic, eat organic. And the advantage of that too is we will change farming. Reward your local organic farmers, support them. And as we grow this market, other farmers will change. We will change society. This is a revolution, and it's as simple as how we spend our dollars. Instead of giving that money to Monsanto, give it to your local organic farmer and all of us will benefit. So thank you very much.